The world's economic engine is losing speed. Inequality is growing, while growth rates have dropped by half or more since the early 2000s in both advanced and developing economies. Trade disruptions, climbing debt, mounting geopolitical tension, and continued environmental damage are upending how economies function, forcing us to take a hard look at how we define and pursue prosperity.
Around the world, this tension between desperately wanting more growth, but at the same time wanting less growth. Economic growth is associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. Economies that grow faster have higher living standards. People live longer and healthier. They have better education systems. But it's also clear that this economic growth comes at a tremendous price: damage to the environment, to widening inequalities in society.
So we find ourselves caught in a tug of war. We need growth to create jobs, fund public services, and tackle big challenges like poverty and climate change, but cannot continue to grow at these costs. This tension is known as the growth dilemma. Some experts say that to solve this dilemma, we need more growth. Others say less. And some say we need to rethink growth entirely.
These are some of the hardest questions we can ask one another. They're questions about what we ought to value. The question we face as a society isn't simply, do we want more or less growth? But it's also, what type of growth do we want as well? And I'm really interested in how we can change the nature of growth.
This expert explains.
When many people think about the idea of economic growth, the sort of metaphor that they have in mind is train drivers sitting in a train, and they can push forward on the throttle and go faster, and they can pull back and go slower. But the sort of direction of travel is set for them by the rails that are fixed in front of them. A far better metaphor is a nautical one. You know, we can lift up our sails and go faster, or we can pull them down and go slower. But there's also a huge amount of discretion over our direction of travel. We can take lots of different routes over the open sea.
Although the pursuit of growth sits at the center of modern economies, it's a relatively recent development. How did we come to view growth this way?
Before the 1950s, almost no politicians, policymakers, economists, anyone was talking about the idea of economic growth. And even if people had wanted to, there was no reliable measure of how large the economy was, whether it was growing, and if so, by how much. That only changes with World War II. Basic question when waging war is how much of the economy can be sliced up and dedicated to the war effort. To the great frustration of British policymakers in the 1940s, there was no way of measuring how large the economy was.
Enter economists John Maynard Keynes and Simon Kuznets. They built the first reliable measure of an economy's size, gross domestic product, or GDP. It tracks goods and services, or how much an economy produces with its resources. Over time, the pursuit of growth comes to mean one thing: relentlessly driving this number upwards.
The way growth becomes such a priority is when the Cold War begins, there's no traditional measures of who's winning. Territory won and lost, soldiers killed, weapons destroyed. And it's growth that becomes a sort of proxy to tell who's winning that conflict. As the 20th century unfolds and the demands of war fall away, the pursuit of growth stubbornly remained behind. So it almost got there by accident.
Accidental or not, we still rely heavily on GDP today. It's used to measure how quickly countries recover after crises like war and pandemics, assess competitiveness, and gauge the impact of trade restrictions. But there's a lot that such a narrow metric can't tell us, like what a society values or how well an economy is functioning for its people. In a climate of rising geoeconomic tensions, can we continue to define success this way?
It's not simply a bad measure of economic value in the market, but it's also a bad measure of what we think is socially valuable in society. My response to the failings of the GDP measure is to identify other things that we think are socially valuable and important and put them alongside the GDP measure in a dashboard, perhaps the state of the environment, perhaps the level of inequality in society, perhaps the availability of good work, perhaps how well our political system is functioning.
Expanding how we measure growth means asking what matters to us as well as economic output, and allows us to track how sustainable and inclusive our progress is. But how do we decide what metrics to include, and who gets to make that call?
One of the great mistakes of the 20th century was to leave it to economists and statisticians and treasuries and government departments to treat it as a technical problem. I think it's up to citizens and it's for politics to decide what gets to go on the dashboard. So I think this is one of the great political questions of our time, and it's for citizens to answer.
So how can we grow in the way that we want to ultimately build the kinds of economies and societies that we want to live in? Where can more human-centered growth come from?
Although politicians and policymakers talk very confidently about the causes of growth today, we actually know very little about it. One lesson that we can draw out of all this fog of uncertainty is that growth comes from technological progress, and technological progress comes from discovering more ideas about the world. Growth doesn't come from using more and more finite resources, more land, more raw materials, building wider roads, building faster trains, building more houses. Growth comes by discovering ever more innovative, creative, inventive, productive ways of using the resources that we have.
We're already seeing smarter ways to grow. Renewable energy lets us produce clean power faster and cheaper. Smart farming technologies like IoT and soil sensors allow farmers to grow more with fewer resources. And the internet has made education more accessible around the world. But because the digital divide remains wide, making sure technology closes gaps and doesn't expand them will be key to ensuring growth benefits everybody.
Technology has an extraordinary promise, but it's not predetermined. We have to make sure that we use technology in a way that benefits society, reforming intellectual property, investing vastly more in research and development, encouraging more people into the parts of the economy that are responsible for generating ideas. We can change the nature of growth as a society if we want to. So the sorts of technologies we develop don't simply make us more prosperous, but they also protect those other important things that we might care about. That, it seems to me, is where prosperity will come from in the 21st century.